With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good Tuesday evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us here in the Situation Room, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to watch this show, to like and subscribe, hopefully, and to get the latest updates on what's going on here in the state of Alabama in regards to coronavirus. Now, I've done a lot of data crunching, some number crunching. There's been some pretty interesting results from that. I probably will wind up sharing a lot of those findings tomorrow, and I find myself really in the same position that a lot of people, both here in the state of Alabama and the federal level, are, which is, I do have data, but I have so little of it that it doesn't really tell a complete story, and I'm still trying to gather enough data just so I can get a story out of it and get the data to actually tell me something. We're dealing with a situation that is so new and so novel, at least compared to anything that has happened in our lifetimes in the modern age where we have all this information at our fingertips. I mean, yes, there are some comparisons with something like the Spanish flu, and I'm not saying those aren't helpful, but ultimately, they don't help us out that much because their data keeping was inaccurate and not always easy to complete back then, and because of that, there's really big gaps in it, and it's not all that reliable. We can make some comparisons, but those comparisons are limited in scope, and so what we're trying to do is gather enough data to where that data actually means something, and we can help you understand it. So let's go ahead and get into what is going on with our coronavirus update for today. So we'll go ahead and bring up the latest from the Alabama Department of Public Health. So we'll go ahead and pull that up. So you can see here that the concentration in where it is happening in Alabama, the different parts of the state, relatively the same as they've been, and really there's not going to be a whole lot of news on there, at least as far as I can tell, anytime in the near future. But the confirmed cases toll has gone up, the death toll has gone up, so we're going to go through each piece of this information. First of all, the 981 confirmed cases, that is a plus 74 from yesterday. Now, you may recall that that's actually down a little bit from yesterday, because yesterday and in the days prior, we've been floating somewhere around the 100 new cases a day mark. This is a plus 74, which is down a little bit, and we're going to talk about a couple of the reasons why that may be the case. 7,249 cases, and you have 13 deaths, at least directly from the coronavirus illness. So we're going to talk about a couple of things here and try to help that data, help you make sense of it and what it means for you and your family and what you can do about it. So first of all, this is actually a few less cases than over the weekend that we averaged out. You may remember we were talking about that data yesterday, that our data was showing that the average cases was just a little under 100, roughly 97, something like that. Coming out to 74 plus in the past 24 hours is actually, not a great sign, and not saying, hey, we're over and we're on a downward slope, but it's a good sign that this thing isn't growing at an exponential rate. It's growing in a numeric rate for sure, but it's not exponential. In other words, you're not having 2 and 3 and 4 times the number of cases that we had yesterday that we had today. The R0 rate is actually relatively low for the Alabama today. If you want an explanation of the R0 rate, it's a technical term for infectious diseases. I think that we covered that, if I'm not mistaken, on Tuesday of last week. So if you want to check back on that show to get an explanation of that, you can do so. So this was a substantial increase in testing, which is a really good thing because it coincides with a decrease in confirmed cases, which means our testing numbers went up, our confirmed cases went down on the same day, which is a good sign because it means the number of tests or the number of cases that we had is not because of a dearth of testing. It is because of a substantial less people actually getting it. However, it is important to note that with 7,249 tests, that's still roughly 13.5%, which is actually up just a little bit than what we were seeing over the past few days. So there is still a substantial number of the people testing actually having the COVID-19 virus, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just saying that we're having an awful lot of cases, and the fact that a lot of people, 13.5% is up from what it originally was when it was floating around 9 to 10. That actually could be a good sign because it means that a whole bunch of people that don't need to be taking the test probably aren't taking it at least as often as they were in the past. Maybe it's because, I don't know if you've seen the diagram of how that test works. They basically stick a Q-tip through your nose into the back of your skull. So maybe that deterred some people that are like, you know what, I really don't think I have coronavirus. I'm pretty sure that this is just seasonal allergies, which is, real common in a state like Alabama, where the pollen levels start kicking up about the end of February and don't start toning it down until, about Halloween. So maybe people are being a little bit more discerning with that, which is a good thing, because you don't need a whole bunch of people that do not need to take the test taking it, because then that clogs up the system and keeps people from actually getting the results back. My friend actually posed an interesting question yesterday because we were looking over some data and noticed that there was a stagnation in the level of new tests that we were getting per day over the past few weeks. And so we were looking specifically at the amount of tests from one day to the next as opposed to the overall testing, which of course has gone up and continues to go up every day. But on the others, there was a stagnation of new tests being formed, which means we were issuing about the same number of tests every day. Again, that could be a good thing or a bad thing. We don't really know. It's just data. But one thing that he postulated for the reason for that happening was, well, maybe what's going on is they're reaching a saturation rate at the CDC. In other words, they're sending these things in to get tested, and the CDC can only issue back a certain number of tests, whether they're positive or negative. Maybe that's the case. I don't know whether it's the CDC or the Alabama Department of Public Health. Maybe what we're seeing is they're finally hitting that ceiling to where they can only issue so many tests in a day because the people that want to get tested, they're only able to do so many, and that may be what's happening there. Could be. Not really sure right now. And since the number of tests went up substantially over the past day, maybe either that was not the case, or, and this is also entirely possible, because this is a continuously developing story, what happened is new information. What happened is new capabilities when it came to the testing. I was just watching President Trump's briefing not long ago where he's talking about how we're issuing some newer tests, some ones that are more accurate. There's another one that only takes 15 minutes to test and gives a very accurate rate of whether you do have it or don't have it. So maybe that's what happened because of the new testing facilities and the new tests that went out. Maybe we're just having quicker turnaround on the test, and maybe we're able to do it with less manpower and so on and so forth. Not real sure, but that is a possibility for why all of that is taking place. Now, one thing that seems a bit off, and I think it does merit some explanation. If we can go ahead and bring that graphic up real quick, some people have been asking about this. You'll notice that there is a new section that they added there at the bottom of the screen in the bottom right-hand corner where there is a disparity between reported deaths and died from illness. So there's a couple different reasons that is possible for this disparity. So the one is very obvious. They could be adjusting to the situation that we had, if you may recall, with our first death, because with the first death that took place in the state of Alabama, what we had was about a 16-hour gap between a death being reported and a death being confirmed that that death was because of coronavirus. That may be what happened, that they had to investigate and make sure, yes, that person actually did have the Wuhan flu and make sure that he actually had it before determining that that was what killed him. And they did and confirmed that that was the case. So maybe what's going on here is they've added the second category as basically the limbo period of deaths that we haven't had time to investigate and check out and make sure that they're actually deaths due to this virus, but we think that they may be. In other words, that's the reason why they have the stipulation reported deaths. There's another one that is, I think, equally plausible. I don't know which of these two that it is, and maybe I can get with one of my contacts and see about that. But one thing that is plausible, at least, is that sometimes what actually kills a person is pretty iffy. And I'm not saying that the Alabama Department of Public Health is trying to hide anything or trying to not do their jobs. The reason that I'm saying this is I have some personal experience with this. For example, my grandmother, she died when I was about 9, and it's somewhat unclear what actually killed her. Because, well, it's not unclear what killed her, but it's hard to categorize it. And here's what I mean by this. She had ovarian cancer. And she had ovarian cancer for about 3 or 4 years. And when she finally died, it was because of a combination of things. First of all, her immune system had been very much depleted, not only from the cancer itself, but also from chemotherapy. And what actually wound up killing her, technically, was pneumonia. And so, how do you characterize that death? Did she die because she got cancer? Well, yeah, probably. Maybe pneumonia could have killed her regardless, but that seems unlikely for a woman that was, I believe at that time, in her late 40s. That seems kind of unlikely for somebody like that was relatively healthy before they found out she had cancer. So maybe it did, maybe it didn't. Did the chemo kill her? Because the chemo is what depleted her immune system to the point to where the pneumonia could kind of kick in and really do a lot of damage. Or was it actually the pneumonia? How do you characterize that death? And I'm just using that as a personal example because you can see now how it could be kind of difficult to determine whether or not coronavirus actually killed somebody or not. Let's say that you have somebody, for example, that has lung cancer, and of course their lungs are going to be under severe strain because they're undergoing chemotherapy or radiation or whatever treatment that they're going through, but the cancer is also weakening their lungs. What if that person gets coronavirus and winds up getting wiped out by something like that, either that or pneumonia or something else that is caused by the virus? What do you characterize that as a death because of lung cancer? Do you characterize it as a death because of pneumonia? Or do you characterize it as a death by coronavirus? You see how you can kind of get into a gray area. And so I'm just saying that this is probably the reason that they're adding the stipulation that there are deaths that are caused directly by coronavirus and deaths that are not necessarily caused by it, maybe caused by something else, maybe it's a contributing factor. Another thing to consider, and thank God we have not gotten to this point yet, but consider Italy. In Italy, there have been people, you can look at videos or different pictures of what's going on in Italy and see that the waiting room for emergency rooms over there are just insane. And most of those people, let's just guess and say 70%, don't hold me to that, it's just a guess, this is a hypothetical, of course, are there for treatment because of the virus. What about 30% that aren't? What happens to them? What if they're there for a completely unrelated thing to the virus? Let's say that there's somebody that's over 60 that is there for a treatment that they need to get checked out, or they're having shortness of breath, or they feel like they're having a heart attack, and the healthcare system is so overwhelmed, there's nothing they can do for those people. Well, if the guy had a heart attack, and he would have survived, theoretically, if he had gotten medical care, but couldn't get that medical care because people were worried about what was going on with the virus, and there were no ventilators left for him, and he died because they didn't have adequate equipment or adequate medical staff or whatever. Okay, you can see how, I don't know, maybe that death was because of what happened with the coronavirus, even though his body didn't physically have the kung flu in him. He didn't have the virus. He wasn't sick because of the virus, but he kind of is dead because of the virus. And so it's one of those things that it's really, really hard. And this is something that's going to be hard no matter what happens, even if everything goes well. It's going to be very, very difficult to put into actual numbers and to adequately measure the harm that is done by this or any other infectious disease. Especially if it winds up overwhelming the healthcare system, like we suggested that it did, there may be people that never contracted the virus that technically did die because of the effects of the virus, not on their own bodies, but on others and upon the healthcare system that they were normally rely on to be able to get the healthcare that they needed. So you can see how that becomes very iffy very fast. Let's go ahead and look at a second graphic because I did want to give some props to this. This is the testing facilities. And we were looking at the map yesterday. You'll see that it's been updated, and there is finally a testing facility in Dothan, which is really the last spot that I said they really need one. I noticed that there's still not one in the Jasper area, but again, with that kind of coverage, you're never more than, I would say, a 20, maybe 30 or 40 minute drive with the number of testing facilities that are on that map now. So I think that this is a win. We'll probably even wind up not really covering that map much anymore because it's still a useful tool to have on the website because you can click on whatever clinic or whatever testing facility is nearest you and find where you're going if you think that you have the COVID-19 virus. And if you do, I sincerely encourage you to do so. But the point is, ultimately, it's something that you probably don't need to look at every single day on the newscast just because, it's kind of gotten to the point to where there's enough coverage that there's really not a story there. So this will probably be the last time that we look at it. But hey, they finally got one in Dothan. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the Department of Public Health or Governor Ivey were watching this is like, you know what, Caleb has a good point. We really should put one in Dothan. I'm sure that's what happened. So anyway, I do have a couple of stories from around the state, and this one is actually a really good news story. So UAB is now testing for the new Kung Flu vaccine. This is a story via Yellowhammer, and we'll go ahead and read it. The testing at the UAB will investigate immune responses to the vaccine in mice, a key step before Gaithersburg, Maryland-based Altume can launch Phase 1 human safety and immunogenicity. Sorry, a lot of medical terms here. I want to say immunogenicity trial patients in the third quarter of this year. Now, that's kind of a mixed thing because we would all really love for there to be a vaccine that is ready right now, but even though they are super fast-tracking this thing and making it basically priority number one, they're saying, yeah, it's still probably going to be quarter 3 before this thing is actually ready for human testing. But UAB is contributing to that. They're doing an important first step in testing the vaccine in mice. So that's, something to be proud of from our state. The COVID-19 vaccine called AdCovid is a single-dose vaccine candidate that is delivered by intranasal spray. Okay, so that's really interesting because instead of a shot or something that you normally would get, the thing that you would normally think of as something that inoculates you to a flu, and this is, of course, a novel version of the flu to a certain degree. It's a novel COVID virus. Coronavirus. It's a novel coronavirus. Atimune created AdCovid, and they really have to have more pronounceable names than this. This irritates me as a broadcaster. In response to the COVID-19 global pandemic, the company has significant experience in development of intranasal vaccine candidates for respiratory pathogens, including a seasonal and pandemic influenza vaccine and a vaccine for inhalation anthrax. The anthrax vaccine candidate is being developed under a $133.7 million contract with the United States Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. So that's obviously a good thing for a number of reasons. First of all, and the very obvious one is we would really like to see some development of some kind of treatment or vaccine for this virus so that even if we finally get through the nightmare that has been corona so far, that we can next year either have something that we can vaccinate people with, and if that's the case, then this thing becomes more or less just another seasonal flu that's not all that bad or not really all that a big deal. Certainly not something that winds up freezing society for a month or two. And if UAB does this, there's also a lot of money coming into the Yellowhammer State and, some prestige as well. Of course, that's not what it's about. It's ultimately about helping people and trying to figure it out. But the fact that UAB has the testing facilities to handle something like this and bring that into the Yellowhammer State is certainly something to be excited about. There's another story that is the exact opposite. I mean, I really got excited to be able to bring you the news of what's going on at UAB. This one, not so much. This is, according to AL.com, a federal judge issued a restraining order to keep Alabama abortion clinics open, and this is their article. United States District Judge Myron Thompson, I don't know what it is, I can't read today. Myron Thompson, the same judge who blocked Alabama's abortion ban from going into effect in November 2019. Oh yeah, I'm sure that guy has no political agenda whatsoever. I'm sure he's a completely impartial federal judge. He ordered in a court filing Monday night that the March 27th order by the Alabama Department of Public Health postponing non-emergency medical procedures would not apply to abortion clinics. Look, regardless, you could be the most pro-choice person out there. I don't see how you can make a case that an abortion is not an elective procedure. I mean, by definition, it is a medical procedure that you elect to have. I fail to see how this is in any way something that would be deemed essential medical procedure. And when you can't even go to the dentist to have a cavity filled in because of this state order, but you can go to murder your child, we have our priorities really screwed up as a society if that is the case. This is his rationale for his decision. Quote, despite the serious conditions described by defendants and the dire need for medical equipment across the United States, the benefits of some potential increase in the availability of equipment, some of which may be ill-suited for the task of disease containment, do not outweigh the serious and in some cases permanent harms imposed by the denial of an individual's right to privacy, Judge Myron Thompson wrote in a court filing. So the individual's right to privacy, in case you're wondering, that's liberal code for right to kill your baby. That's basically what it's been for about 50 years now. Because that's the language of Roe v. Wade, and so when they write that, what they're actually saying is the right to murder your child in the womb. That's what they're talking about, because it's a derivative right from a derivative right. And I won't go into all the history of Roe v. Wade and how it came about, but essentially, suffice it to say that that's what he's saying there. So, apparently, it's far too dangerous, and everything has to go on hold, and medical procedures, any kind of elective procedure at all, something that, in other words, is not life-threatening or something that needs to be taken care of very quickly, those all have to halt, well, except, of course, abortions. I mean, this judge literally just created a special carve-out specifically for abortions and nothing else. That's astounding. That you have judges in this country and the left is so far on this train, so far down this road, and they have chosen the hill that they want to die on, to where we're okay with shutting down the entirety of society, we're okay with tanking the economy, because this thing is such a big deal, and there's some debate as to whether or not it really should be done or how to handle that. This is something that I don't understand not having bipartisan agreement on. Like, even if you're incredibly in favor of abortion, and I think that, frankly, you're a horrible human being if you are, but I would at least have some modicum of respect for you saying, well, yeah, but it is an elective medical procedure, and we probably don't need to be doing this in the middle of, I mean, think about this. The left is constantly berating people that are pro-life, that want to actually protect children in the room, for saying they're a bunch of crazy religious zealots that are closed-minded, and they're just clinging to their ideology regardless of the circumstances surrounding it. But here we have Christians, devout Christians, people that never miss a church service, are there every single time, that people that actually live out the gospel. It's not just something that they do a couple times a year on the high holidays. Saying, yeah, we'll close church service and we'll figure out a way to do it over the internet. They're working around it. But these people are saying, nope, we're not going to halt it at all. Don't care what the risk is. Doesn't matter to us. Don't care that there's a order in place. We're going to continue to do it. That just absolutely blows my mind. That we're the religious zealots and we're adjusting around the order, and they're saying, nope, full steam ahead. We're not even going to slow it down. But we're the ones that are crazy and extreme, apparently. So that is evidently where it stands. And it goes on to say, the temporary restraining order will last until April 13th, 2020, at 5 p.m., when the court will reconsider the order in the light of the defendant's responses. I know it comes as no surprise. The American Civil Liberties Union of Alabama earlier Monday had filed an emergency request, so that's how this came about, the ACLU, in federal court to prevent Alabama from using the COVID-19 pandemic to prevent people from obtaining an abortion. Now, everybody knows how I feel about abortion, and as horrible as this virus is, if it saves some babies' lives, that would be a silver lining, a good outcome to a really bad situation. But even if you remove that from it, the idea that they are willing to go full steam ahead on this thing, and they are willing to die on this hill and say, no, we will not even slow this thing down. We're going to specifically carve out a special exception just for this one medical procedure that is elective. None of the others are. Nobody else, gets this exception. Just people that are performing abortions is absolutely sickening. This is the thing that they refuse to budge on. On some political issues, it makes sense to be an absolutionist. On some political issues, I understand the logic. Even if I wind up disagreeing with the conclusion, I can see the logic for why you don't want to budge an inch on something. I do not understand this one, because it's not even something that would be permanent, and it's not even something that is specifically singling them out. It's not as though Governor Ivey, left it vague, or specifically said, oh, and by the way, we're closing down abortion clinics. The language of the order is, and whether you agree with the order or not, I have some issues with it, and we already talked about that, but it's elective medical procedures are to be halted. But here we have a federal judge and the ACLU saying, we're going to have this special carve-out just for abortions and nothing else. This will be the only elective medical procedure that we're going to allow, and the women's ability to kill their children, that's something that just cannot be abridged. It's so strange that killing babies is like the one thing they don't want to budge an inch on. I think that says an awful lot about where their priorities are. But nonetheless, we do have a few other things to talk about. As I said right before this, I was just watching President Trump's briefing before about the coronavirus, and it did talk about something that was specifically really important to the state of Alabama. Now, in this briefing, they had a graph that it showed, and what I really appreciate about this, because it just debuted, so I didn't have time to get the graph myself, I'm just going off of memory, and I'll describe it to you. It has a line of new coronavirus cases for all 50 states, and it is adjusted per capita. In other words, they're not just comparing raw numbers of Montana to California, because that would in no way be a fair comparison. I mean, California has many times the population of Arkansas or Maine or Rhode Island. And so what they did was, it is per capita adjusted, which is really helpful, and it showed the number of new cases. The only two states that had an exponential curve, in other words, a spike that we've been predicting without mitigation, in other words, the social distancing and all the other protocols that have been put in place, are New York and New Jersey, which is fascinating for a number of reasons. First of all, New York and New Jersey did get a slower start, because you may recall that a couple other states that had very early cases would be Washington State and California. Both of those had cases before New York City, if I'm not mistaken, or at least confirmed cases. Washington State was actually the first one to have a case of the coronavirus, but they jumped on containment really early. And because of that, their increase has not hit that exponential spike when adjusted for population, at least not yet. New York and New Jersey both have. There's a couple reasons for that. First of all, those states are states that are international hubs. Now, Washington and California to a great degree are as well, which is why it's fair to compare those two to them. But New York and New Jersey just have so much traffic from the rest of the world, it puts them at high risk, and it's somewhat acceptable or at least understandable why they would have such a massive spike. But like I said, comparing them to LA and California, and also in Washington State and Seattle, that's a pretty fair comparison because they have a lot of traffic, especially from the Asian countries, which, I mean, the last time you checked, I know that this is racist and I'm going to be thrown off of YouTube for saying this, but yeah, the virus did come out of China. So the idea that LA and Washington State wouldn't have seen nearly as much traffic, that's just not an argument that would fly. So what that means is that the containment strategy has worked and that there is a fair comparison to be made. I get that there's also environmental factors and a couple of other things that put New York and New Jersey to disadvantage, but what it does show is overall, to a great degree, this is working. And it was a good explanation of why the president yesterday decided to expand the time in which we are going to have to stay self-quarantined and keep these measures in place. One of the things that he talked about, and it made sense, and you can see, looking at that and understanding the new information and the new numbers that he's putting out, he's made this decision, and I think it's probably the right call. It also has me very worried for a number of reasons, but I do appreciate at least, and I know that a whole lot of people just tried to excoriate him in the media, tried to go after him for this, which is stupid on a number of reasons, that he is looking for getting back to work. And when he gave the deadline of Easter, of course, now he's adjusted that and announced that it will be April 30th and not Easter, and that's about how long we're going to try to social distance in order to keep the spread of the virus from happening, keep the Wuhan flu as, keep that curve as flat as humanly possible so we don't overwhelm the system. He was showing the progress so far in the models at mitigation and where we actually are, and it's actually pretty close, which means a lot of the strategies that are being put in place do work. But the reason the president was going to try to open it back up is because, for exactly the reason that he said, he doesn't want the cure to be worse than the disease. And if we wind up tanking the American economy, and I believe that we're resilient, I believe that we can come back for this, but the thing you have to understand is that the economy is a living, breathing thing to a great degree. I'm using a metaphor, of course, but it's not a switch. It's not like you can shut the whole thing down and then, like your computer, you reboot it and in a week or two it's back to where it was beforehand. That's not how the economy works. If several segments of the economy start dying off, it's almost like denying oxygen to an animal that breathes oxygen. You can do it for a while, and maybe they even still survive, but if you do it for over a couple of minutes, even if they wind up living, they're not going to be the same. You're going to cause brain damage. The oxygen deprivation is going to cause all kinds of side effects, some that might even be permanent. And so when it comes to this, I do think the economy is a lot tougher and a lot more resilient than some people are giving it credit for. But ultimately, I do understand that this is something that is going to have lasting effects if we shut the valve off for too long. In a lot of ways, and this is something that I have personal experience with, it's kind of like chemotherapy. Like, you do really want to get rid of the cancer, but you can't just pump a person full of as much chemo as you can get into them because that'll kill them. It's toxic. And so what's trying to happen here is that President Trump is trying to open up the country again for business as soon as possible. That's a good sentiment that he has. I don't want him to declare victory beforehand, to use his phraseology, because I don't think that that's going to do any good. And that means we basically wasted shutting down the economy, even for the brief period of time that we did. And on top of that, not only did we waste that, but, now it comes back and the disease is just as bad, and we did all this for nothing. I don't want that. But at the same time, I like the fact that he is looking forward towards how are we going to get this vehicle moving again? Because a lot of people in the media are upset with him for even contemplating that. That's a serious concern that he has to think about. And not just him, but a lot of other elected officials, and they would do well to try to think like that, because if this thing shuts down for too long, we may permanently damage it, and damaging America's economy might actually cause more deaths than the coronavirus ever could. The whole rest of the world depends on the American economy. Do you have any idea how much of the world's food supply America grows? How much energy we produce? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The reason that China's economy even has some modicum of success despite being under a communist regime is that America buys a lot of stuff from them. And other countries are in the same boat. And so you do have to consider that this is something that could have really dire ramifications if it's allowed to go on too long. And looking at this and looking at the fact that Washington and California have been able to maintain fairly low numbers while New York and New Jersey haven't, and by the way, Alabama was in that cluster as well of the other 48 states that have been able to keep it low, which is, something that is definitely positive for us. That shows that the things that we're doing now are having a positive effect and they are working. And so that's something to look at, and President Trump saw that and saw that the strategy is working and saw that if we stop now, then all that goes down the toilet essentially, and we wind up with that big exponential spike that Italy had and China had, and he said, well, we got to shut it down for a little longer. So I'm asking everybody to adhere to this, to do the best that you can to, and this is something that is hard for me to do because I'm on day 16 of my quarantine and I'm getting a little antsy. And I say this as an extreme introvert that can entertain himself for a really, really long time as long as I've got video games and a streaming service of some kind. But even I'm starting to get a little bit, anxious. And the idea of doing this for another 30 days, it's not something that I want to think about, but for the good of the country, for the good of the economy, and for our own good, this is something that we really need to adhere to, I would say for at least another 15 days, maybe another 30. I don't know. We'll see where it goes. But there was one question at the briefing that really stuck out. And of course, and I wasn't looking specifically for this person, but it doesn't surprise me that this is where the question that kind of bothered me came from. Jim Acosta, who loves him some Jim Acosta. Man, does that guy love some Jim Acosta. So Jim Acosta asked the president, well, doesn't this prove that we need a national stay in place? Well, no. Because, roughly half the states that you're looking at on that graph that was just shown don't have a mandatory stay in place. Alabama doesn't have a mandatory stay in place. Texas does as of today, but I even think that was unnecessary because Texas was in that same cluster too. Despite being one of the biggest states and despite it being a per capita comparison to adjust for population, Texas was just down there with all the other states, and there was really no reason for them to amp up a stay-at-home order and mandate that people stay home. They're doing it on their own. The American people understand the severity of this. And just doing things that make sense and listening to the experts, they've done this on their own. And think about this too. New York and New Jersey, one of those has a mandatory stay home. And it's one of the ones that is an outlier on that has more cases per capita than any other place. So it's just a dumb question by Jim Acosta that, well, we need to issue a national stay in place. Why? What's being done right now is working. It doesn't make any sense to do that. But as most liberals do, in their mind, People are just not going to do something unless the government tells them to do it because they assume the average American is an idiot that has to be told what to do and has to be held by the hand, can't think for themselves. They're always going to do the wrong thing unless the big nanny state comes down and mandates that no, they must do the thing that they want them to do. The people are doing it on their own. There's no reason to strong arm them. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that on the other side of this break. We'll talk about that when we come back.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible printed on 100% organic biodegradable paper. Today's reading comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, verses 3 through 10. And it says, Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all? And he answered and said, Have you not read on your Bible apps that he who created him from the beginning made them male and female, and trans, and pansexual, and non-binary, and Jupiter gender, or one of the 150 other options? And said, For this reason, a man/woman/other shall leave Z's father and mother, or father and father, or mother and mother, or two mothers, father, and their special friend Sequoia, and be joined to his wife, or wives, or husband, or life partners, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer 2 or 3 or 14, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. I mean, unless of course it's like super difficult, or there's money problems, or bedroom problems, or you meet somebody that you like better, or that initial spark goes away and you just fall out of love, or you're just unhappy for any reason, then divorce is totally understandable. They said to him, Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away? He said to them, Because Moses wasn't woke enough. He was some rich, spoiled prince who was probably white and a tool of the patriarchy. So why do you care what he thinks? And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman, it's totally cool with God as long as you're happy. That is all God wants, after all. The disciples said to him, That sounds super convenient. Thanks, Jesus. Wow. So inspirational. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And now for a
And welcome back, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us through the break. So one thing that has been really astounding to watch the past few days is how willing and ready and frankly, eager, I would say is the best way to describe it, people are to have their freedoms robbed from them. So just looking at a cursory view of the news stories over the past few weeks, the rights that are under attack during this whole virus scare, the rights to religion, the rights to freedom of assembly, the rights to property, the rights to keep and bear arms. There's been several governors and local officials that shut down gun stores. The right to a speedy and fair trial. There have been people that have been incarcerated without any kind of trial because of these emergency procedures, which is also fascinating considering that there are also states, some of the same jurisdictions, they're just straight up letting prisoners out of prison, which is really strange. The right to mobility, which is not one that is explicitly put out in the Constitution, but one that is implicitly drawn. And, of course, one of the big ones that has taken a beating the past few weeks is federalism. These things are all being challenged, and I am worried, looking at the rest of the world, that we're going to see a couple of others under fire before too long. For example, freedom of speech, which China and Iran have really been cracking down on. In fact, this whole thing started with China suppressing speech. You may remember that the doctor that actually originally discovered the novel COVID-19 virus, that he was the one that China tried to silence and basically held a gun to his head and forced him to sign a piece of paper saying, no, I got it all wrong. Everything's fine. I don't know why I said that. That was just silly. And then he died from coronavirus. Or a bullet to the head, we're still not sure. But anyway, so ironically, the whole thing started with China suppressing speech, and China has been suppressing speech, trying to make the administration look less incompetent than it is in handling this thing, which largely caused it to spread to the rest of the world because of China's gross incompetence and desire to save face. Iran's been doing the same thing, trying to stifle speech and people speaking out against how their government is handling it. And I'm also worried, not really something that has happened yet, but could. You remember that back when Hurricane Katrina happened, the National Guard just straight up occupied some people's homes, and at one point even a church building. And so that would be a violation of one that we don't really hear a lot about, the Third Amendment, which prohibits quartering of soldiers and private property. And so some of these constitutional rights, people are just kind of throwing caution to the wind and getting rid of them. Now, property rights would, of course, be a really big one that has taken a beating. First of all, people who are selling supplies because they're being deemed hoarders or because of price gouging legislation. And as I've said 1,000 times and explained, there is no such thing as price gouging. There is what you are willing to pay for a product and what you are willing to part with a product for, and that's it. That's what a market is. Price gouging is not a thing. And anyway, I'm not going to go off into that whole tangent because I could spend another 30 minutes just on that. But this happened to a man in Chattanooga where he was selling supplies back before this thing got really bad in Tennessee. It was really only concentrated in California. And so he was selling certain supplies like hand sanitizer, like toilet paper, things that they were running out of to people in California, which means that there were people that wanted a product that were getting more of that product from a place that didn't need it as much. In other words, supply and demand took effect. And because there was more demand in one market than another market, supplies that were more needed in that market moved to the new market, but the state shut that down and confiscated his property for the crime of wanting to sell it. So there's a number of issues that we're having with property rights. People are not allowed to take more than a certain amount out of their banks. They're having to literally call the federal government if you want to take a certain amount over what you would normally do. And the amount varies based on where you are and who you are. But if you want to take a large amount of money out of your own bank account, your own money, they have to call and get permission from the federal government for you to get your own money in cash. It's absolutely insane, but this is what is going on here in America. Now, President Trump recently ordered, and this is a pretty egregious violation of the Constitution on a couple of parts in his, because keep in mind, property rights, that's one of the big three. The big three that are named, that are the basis of all other rights in the Declaration of Independence, because when you have freedom of things like speech and religion and what, they're all based on three basic rights that were sort of originally talked about by John Locke and then translated by Thomas Jefferson into a slightly more applicable version, life, liberty, property. In the Declaration of Independence, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the original draft, it was property. And it was changed actually because of slavery and because people didn't want there to be a right to slavery, which is the reason it was adjusted to pursuit of happiness, which was more general. But ultimately, property rights is one of the three primary rights that inspired the Bill of Rights to begin with. And so the fact that it's one that is taking a pretty big beating right now is astounding. See, property is that which you have the right to deny access to. For example, I own my truck. Why? Because I can keep people that I don't want to use it from using it. If I had no legal right to prevent a person from using my truck, it wouldn't be my truck. Same thing with your house, same thing with anything, really. If I own my cell phone, but at any time anybody could walk up to it, or even if it wasn't anybody, even if it was just, a handful of select people, regardless, if I do not have the ability to deny that access to someone else, it's not really mine. And this goes for any kind of property. If you look at the intellectual property, for example, the reason that other people can't use my intellectual property, things that I have come up with and that I own the rights to, if anybody could just, draw Mickey Mouse and make a Mickey Mouse cartoon, then that's not really Disney's property because they can't deny access to other people. That's how property works. And yet, we have President Trump ordering GM now that they must make ventilators. Now, I have praised companies for actually foregoing whatever they were doing and repurposing and retooling their factories and their industry to do things to help with this crisis. I think that it's a fantastic thing. I applauded Ford for doing this. There have been other companies that have worked with, for example, 3M or GE Healthcare to try to make ventilators, masks, respirators, all kinds of things, and GM is among them. They are one of the companies doing this, but with the Defense Production Act, which is an older law that was put out in the 50s, President Trump has essentially tried to use this and threatened to use it. I don't think that he's actually invoked it yet. But he has said that he is going to invoke that in order to force GM to make ventilators faster. Now, they already retooled to make these ventilators. He's saying that he's going to order them to make more of them, which I don't know what the hangup is. I don't know if there's technical difficulties. I don't know, because it's really difficult to retool an entire factory to make a completely different thing than you were making before. But for whatever reason, President Trump felt that this was warranted. And here's the reason that I have a big problem with that. I've already expressed why it's a violation of property rights to do so, but on top of it being a violation of rights, which would be, way more than enough than I would need to rebuke him for doing so, you also have this. Do you know what the definition of socialism actually is? Well, let's take a look. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, socialism: any of the various economic and political theories advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. Yeah. Can anybody, I challenge anyone to do this in the comment section, in a video rebuttal, however you want to do it, whatever form. Can anyone please explain to me how what President Trump just proposed to doing is not socialism? Because I'm looking at the definition and it's government ownership and administration of the means of production and the distribution of said goods. That's exactly what President Trump just proposed. I don't see how there's any difference there. I don't see where there is a distinction drawn. What President Trump is talking about is socialism, plain and simple. I'm not saying he wants to overhaul the entire system and make the entire country socialist, but what he has proposed doing is indeed a socialist idea. I'm sure Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are very proud of him right now. They wouldn't say that, but they would agree with what he's doing. This is a textbook example of socialism. And President Trump should stay far away from this. I think that it's great that there are companies that are willing to, of their own volition, do things to try to help the cause, but forcing them to do it violates every principle that this country was founded on. Not only the right to liberty, in other words, the freedom to do what you want as opposed to being ordered by a government official that what you must do, and property, the ability to deny access of the things that you own to other people. This violates two of those core principles. And if that weren't bad enough, you have a $2 trillion stimulus, and the Republicans are just as guilty as the Democrats when it comes to this thing. Let's go ahead and take a look at what is in this $2 trillion behemoth. That's right, trillion with a T, $2 trillion spent on this stimulus in a single day. What's in this thing? First of all, you have the direct payments. This is the thing that people are talking about, where the government will be sending out individual checks to every citizen in the United States. So according to this, the direct payments, single Americans would receive $1,200. Married couples would get $2,400. So there's really no advantage to being a married couple other than the fact that you just get the amount for both you and your spouse. So it's the same amount for every adult, $1,200. It's just married couples get it lumped together because they're married. And then you would also see $500 for each child under the age of 17. Now, doing some simple math, we can find these calculations pretty quickly. There are 253.8 million adults in this country and 73.2 million children under the age of 18, which means that if you add that up together and take those amounts, you get a grand total of $341 billion. Now, there's only 140.9 million taxpayers in America. So I had a friend ask me, well, how is this different than just giving a tax cut to everybody? And here's how. You just heard the number. We are a nation of 327 million people, yet there's only 140.9 million taxpayers. You see the discrepancy there? The vast majority of the American population doesn't pay. Now, to be fair, there are some people that it makes sense that they're not paying if they're minors, for example, when there's about 73 million minors that aren't paying taxes. That actually makes sense. But if you add that up and you do the math, and this is just this one provision, not the $2 trillion stimulus, just the checks. That means if you are a taxpayer, your $1,200 costs you $2,420. Only the government could make a check to you cost you money. And not only cost money, but cost almost double what that is. And by the way, that's assuming that there is there's no interest at all, which of course it's a loan because it's debt that we're acquiring, so there is interest involved. And that's also assuming that there will be no inflation, which is kind of unlikely considering the Fed just printed $4 trillion worth of money. We'll get to that in a second. But the point is, even if there's no inflation and there's no interest on the loan whatsoever, it's still costing you more than double the amount that they're giving you for you to get it. It would make far more sense to them to just give a tax break. You see, here's the thing. Governments, especially in emergencies, they have a hard time undoing policies that give money to people because they're popular. What is really easy for the government to undo is when you deny something to them. If we were to give a tax break until this emergency was over, you better believe the second that they believed the emergency was, going to give out the all clear signal, that they would start taxing again. That's not a thing that we have to worry about them saying, oh gosh, we forgot to turn the taxing back on. So something like that makes sense because they're going to undo it of their own volition. Something like this, they may not. Something like this could continue on, indefinitely. Remember that Social Security was supposed to be a temporary program to help people that were in trouble during the Great Depression in the 1930s. And we're still going on about it right now. I'm not saying that this is necessarily means we're going to have a universal basic income across the board for the rest of time, but that's a possibility. And it's not a possibility that the government is just going to forget to, continue to take taxes. That's not a thing that they're going to forget. And so it made more sense to stop taking taxes rather than doing this massive redistribution of wealth, because there's a massive portion of the American population that doesn't pay taxes. And so by any other definition, this is a redistribution of wealth. Smart and cautious people also, when they do get these checks, they're going to save it. They're not going to be spending a lot of money because, they understand this is an unprecedented time. They're probably going to want to save on to every penny as long as they can. They're probably living on a limited budget right now, which would be the smart thing to do. But that also means if they're not going to spend it, that's not something that's going to stimulate the economy. So this thing not only is going to cost us more than double what we're actually paying for it, or the money that we're actually receiving, but on top of that, it's still not going to accomplish its intended goal. And I actually have an entire Daily Dose of Stupid if you want to check out some of the commentary on that as well. But this is why it just made so much more sense to suspend taxes and not just write checks to people. Another thing that's in the stimulus bill, student loans are suspended with no interest. This one actually does make sense. It makes sense to suspend student loans and not do it with interest, because the second that this thing is over, they're going to kick that back up. Again, that goes back to the taxation thing. They're not going to just forget about it. They're going to kick it back up at some point. So it makes sense that they just put it all on hold, at least for the time being. The Real ID deadline delay, that's really not one that costs us any money, and that one makes sense too. That's just getting the new federal IDs. I disagree with that program even existing, but if it is going to exist, it makes sense to postpone it. It also boosts the unemployment benefits an extra $600 per 4 months. So I don't think that unemployment should be handled at the federal level at all. I think that it makes more sense for this to be handled at the state level. But even if you accept that there are unemployment benefits at both the federal and the state level and think that's how it should be, this still makes more sense to do the stimulus portion of this at the state level, and here's why. Some states naturally, because of the things that they produce, because of the things that they move around, depending on their natural resources, depending on the demographics living within their state, they're going to be hit at different levels and also at different times. So it makes sense for each state to individually look at their own parameters and what's going on around them and the situation within their own borders and make decisions on things like this. It makes far more sense to let the states handle this individually, because A, that also means that I, as a federal taxpayer, don't have money going off to some place that's nowhere near me and stimulating another economy, even if it wound up working, which I have my doubts on that. But even if that were the case, not only do I not have to worry about that, the individual state legislatures and governors can look at their own situation within their state and decide what is the best time and also what is the right amount to issue out these stimulus packages. So this is something that I can see the rationale behind it, but it makes far more sense for it to occur at the state level. And also, this seems redundant, doesn't it? Like, if you're sending out direct payments to every single American citizen, why are you also extending unemployment benefits? That doesn't make sense. In fact, you may recall that even far left-leaning, but genuinely intelligent person, Andrew Yang, suggested that the universal basic income would basically replace those social programs, which I didn't like the universal basic income, but I have to admit that's a lot better than a welfare state. That's a lot better than the money only being distributed to the people that the government deems in its infinite wisdom should be getting this money. And this is the worst of both worlds. We're also issuing universal basic income, and we're also giving extra unemployment benefits. If we're giving the universal basic income, even if it's just for a month, why would we expand unemployment payments? They can just use the money that they got as citizens of the United States. It doesn't make any sense. It really is baffling the way that they handled this thing. Some states are going to be hit harder than others. We already talked about that. There's going to be also included in this $500 billion in government loans. Now, again, this is something where I do see the rationale. And even though I think that this should also be something that is handled at the state level, what really baffles me with this is, just like what we just talked about with the expansion of unemployment benefits, this also makes no sense if you're doing universal basic income. Look, if you're going to write out stimulus checks to individual citizens, it doesn't make sense to give money to the businesses to keep them afloat. If you want to do one or the other, I may disagree with it, but at least I understand the rationale. Either we're going to pay employers directly, telling them that they have to keep their employees employed and keep them working and keep them sustained through that so that they don't have to look for a job when this is all over. Or we can pay the citizens directly to help keep them afloat independent of whether or not they have a job. But doing both doesn't make any sense. And so, again, this seems like a redundant thing. It's almost like they're just trying to find new ways to spend money. Some other things that are in this bill. On this, though, I will say that one thing that makes this better is that this $500 billion is loans, not handouts. So the difference in this and the universal basic income checks is that at least for this, it is a loan. So it has to be paid back. It's going to be paid back at a very low interest rate. But at least this one I can kind of understand why you're wanting companies to stay sustained. And even though I'm not a fan of corporate welfare, this technically isn't corporate welfare because even though it's a low-risk, low-interest loan, it is one that they do eventually have to pay back to the taxpayer. And then there's a $2.2 billion that are for border security, but not a border wall, which is odd. I mean, granted, building a wall right now doesn't make sense because it wouldn't really combat the coronavirus. It's a little late for that. But a wall is actually something that would help, especially when you consider that Mexico has done literally nothing to try to combat this thing. The president's still out kissing babies and meeting with people. They're not doing any social distancing, no government protocols whatsoever. And yet, an open border is something that we want during this thing? No, I think that the wall should have been built several years ago. But the point is, it seems odd to specifically designate that a border wall can't be, this $2.2 billion for defense cannot be used for a border wall. There's several other items here. $32 billion for grants to airlines. Okay, there is a national security concern for sustaining airlines, and we've basically shut all of them down, which is not their fault. So I think that it would make more sense for these things to be in business loans like we saw earlier, but I kind of see the rationale of trying to do what we can to keep the airlines afloat. There is actually a legitimate function of the federal government, national defense, involved in that, and that being a legitimate concern. And that's something that a state really wouldn't be able to handle. $117 billion for hospitals and $100 billion to public health initiatives. Again, this is something that at least I understand the reason that it's included in this thing. Still think it should be handled at the state level to adjust and cater to specific local needs. Let's see, $25 million for the Kennedy Performing Arts Center. I'll be honest, I don't even understand why we're funding that one to begin with. Like, why are we funding a public arts center in Washington, D.C.? That's mind-boggling to me. The federal government shouldn't be funding that to begin with, much less in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic. Like, that's a very odd thing to include in a stimulus bill. How is that going to stimulate the economy? Oh, and by the way, just in case you were wondering, there's another $75 billion for the National Endowment for the Arts. Again, why is that a federal program in the first place? Much less one that is included in this bill. And then another $350 million for refugees. I might even agree with some of the spending on that, but really, right now? And isn't that something that private charity would do a better job of? So you get the idea. This thing is loaded down with stuff that has nothing to do with the virus or containing it. And then, that's not even counting that there are $4 trillion in bank bailouts by the Fed. So the federal government, which, by the way, didn't even need the approval of Congress, just bailed out with $4 trillion, double what was spent in the stimulus package, bailing out to the banks. Now, if there's anything that the left and right ought to be able to get together on, you would think it would be this. Being against $4 trillion of our money, almost the entirety of the federal budget being spent in one day to bail out the banks. That means, in total, we have spent $6 trillion, and none of it was offset by cuts. So, your family is probably going through a tough time right now, just like almost all of us. You're probably conserving as much as you can, maybe even eating a little less than you normally do, being a little more conservative with the family budget because you don't know what's coming around the bend, and that's the smart thing to do. If you know that you're going to have to spend a lot in one area because you may have expenses like you're spending more on certain things that you wouldn't normally spend it on, you got to cut back in some areas. And that's what a normal, rational person does. The federal government is not normal nor rational. They just spent a whole bunch of money on top of what they were already planning to spend. And so this is not only $6 trillion in spending, it's $6 trillion in spending on top of what they had already budgeted for us to spend, which was a little under $5 trillion. So they already spent more than their entire annual budget in pure debt spending in a single week. I cannot overstate how dangerous this is. Because the entire federal budget is only $4.8 trillion, and we spent $6 trillion in less than a week. We acquired all that debt in no time flat. To put this into perspective, it took America until 1986. Remember, we were founded in 1776. So 210 years to acquire $2 trillion in debt. Just the cost of the stimulus package. If you're counting that plus the bailout that the Federal Reserve just did, that would be $6 trillion. It took us to 2002 to get to that level. So between George Washington and George W. Bush, that's how long it took us to get to $6 trillion in debt. We acquired that in 24 hours. Think about that. What it took America 226 years to get to, we did in a day. And that's where we are right now. We are in a completely unsustainable path. There is no way we can continue on like this. And to put this into perspective for people on the right and the left, whether you think it was justified or not, whether you thought it was a good idea or not, whatever, to put it into perspective, you remember how angry the Tea Party was, or how angry conservatives were at the level of spending during the Obama administration? I was one of them, and I stand by that. The Obama administration was always thought of as having just outrageous levels of spending, and it did. The entire amount of debt that President Obama racked up in his first term, President Trump's administration spent in a day. His whole first term, all the way up to 2012. That was all the debt that the Obama years racked up. President Trump spent it in a day. And what's crazier about this is it's not over. President Trump is actually suggesting we should actually do more than this. This is a tweet from him earlier. When the interest rates for the United States being at zero, this is the time to do our decade-long awaited infrastructure bill. It should be very big and bold, $2 trillion, and focused solely on rebuilding the once great infrastructure of our country, Phase 4. Are you kidding me? We just spent $6 trillion, and you right now are pushing a $2 trillion infrastructure bill for your pet projects. That's absolutely insane. You want to spend $8 trillion in the span of a couple of months? If this takes place, then President Trump will have accrued more debt than the entire 8 years of the Obama administration within the span of a couple of weeks. Think about that. There is no way America can keep this going. Now that's debt, not total spending, just debt. Just debt of the Obama administration. President Trump wants to acquire in the span of a couple weeks. Now, I know that people are going to be watching this and they're going to be angry with me, but you don't understand, Caleb. It's an emergency. We have to do this. An emergency is the time where we have to be most vigilant about our rights and about our freedom and about the money that is being spent because it is used as an excuse to override those things. I mean, you look at how the first republic that Earth ever tried, the first republic that humans took a stab at, Rome, how did it come crashing down? How did it cease to be a free republic? Because in an emergency, they gave emergency power to a man named Octavian. And Octavian refused to give the power back. He dragged the emergency out as long as possible until eventually he just became the emperor and disbanded the Senate and became Caesar. That's how the first free republic fell. And if we're not careful, we're going to be remembered as the free republic that fell because of an emergency, just like they were. Benjamin Franklin once said that when you give up essential liberty for temporary security, you will wind up having neither and deserving neither. Now, that's a paraphrase, but that's essentially what he said. Thomas Jefferson said that he preferred a dangerous freedom to a peaceful slavery. Now is the time to fight for our freedoms. I get that we're all scared. I get that we're worried about our own security and being safe and everything. I understand that. But the thing about it is, a dangerous freedom is still better than enduring tyranny, even if it happens to be peaceful. Our liberties are at stake here. And if we don't defend them, they're just not going to be defended. Let's go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Now, for today's Chaplain's Report, we're going to be in the early part of the book of 1 Samuel. To give you a little bit of background, whenever we think of the book of Samuel, we usually think of a couple of things. We think of Samuel and we think of David. And to be honest, that's what I think of whenever I think of the book of Samuel too, because the book centers around those two characters, the life of David and the life of Samuel. So there's nothing wrong with that being the first thing that we associate, but sometimes I think we gloss over and overlook a really important and very telling story that Samuel is a character in, but he's not the main character that the book really starts out with. Because of course, the whole book at the beginning sort of centers around Samuel's birth and him becoming a priest. But there's another character in there that we don't really talk about all that often, a priest and a prophet named Eli. And God was very, very angry with Eli's sons because Eli, he was a pretty just, devout person. And he's actually spoken of pretty highly in certain portions of the scripture here in the early parts of 1 Samuel. He's actually a pretty good guy, except for one major flaw that he has, and it's not him, which seems unfair. It's his sons. His sons, who are also Levites and priests. You see, they do a whole bunch of things that they shouldn't be doing, and it pretty much all centers around the fact that they take advantage of both their family and their position as Levites. So being of the tribe of Levi and also being in a position of leadership, being priest of God, they take advantage of that. So a couple of things that it describes here, just to give you sort of a taste of the kind of things that they were doing, is while they were involved in their priestly duties, there was a tradition where you would basically, when a offering was being determined, that you would scoop out with a fork whatever meat was going to be the portion for the priest, because, priests work in the temple, and so they don't farm or ranch, and they don't produce the food themselves. They take a small portion of the offering to God to provide for themselves, kind of like the way that in modern churches, preachers will take a salary that is a small portion of the offering that is given to God. It's not a one-to-one comparison, but it's kind of close, and it helps us as modern readers understand this. And so they would take, so it would be pure chance and not something that they were intentionally taking the best cut of meat or the cut of meat that they preferred the most or the biggest cut of meat. They did it at random, so they would just scoop in with a meat hook and bring out, and whatever they brought out with the meat hook completely at random, because they couldn't see the meat when they were doing this, that was their portion. They were doing this practice to where they were specifically taking the biggest cut of meat, the best cut of meat. And another thing, which was even worse, is they were also taking advantage of people that were coming to worship God. They were taking advantage of them with their sacrifices, and what's really horrific is they were taking the young women that came to worship God and basically having their way with them sexually. So there was a lot of really horrible things that was going on, and these people were abusing their position as people who were supposed to be representatives of God and taking advantage of people that sincerely wanted to worship God there in Israel, which is something that is pretty consistent through Scripture, that God obviously can be wrathful about a good number of things if you defy his will or disobey or rebel against him. There's very few things that God's going to get more angry about at you than taking advantage of him when you're supposed to be representing him. You'll remember that the one time we have recorded in the Gospels where Jesus was angry was when people were essentially doing the same thing in Israel, where people were taking advantage of and extorting people that were there to worship God. And so this is not something that God takes lightly, and we see that really, this is the reason that God is angry with Eli, even though it's his sons that are doing this. And you'll see the reason why here in 1 Samuel 2, verse 29, where he says, and this is God speaking through a prophet to Eli, "Why do you kick my sacrifice and my offering, which I have commanded in my dwelling, and honor your sons above me, but making yourselves fat with the choicest of every offering of my people Israel?" So even though this wasn't something that, as far as we can tell, Eli was doing himself, God was very angry at him for allowing his sons to do so. Now, he had rebuked his sons. He had told his sons not to do this kind of stuff. But basically, it was like, no, don't do this. And that was the end of it. There was no punishment. There was no actual going out and punishing them or keeping them from doing this. It was basically like Eli told them to stop, and that was about the end of it, but they just kept doing whatever they were doing anyway. And so I think that the really telling phrase in that verse is, "You honor your sons above me." In other words, even though it's a good thing to love your children, and even though God wants parents to love their children, he doesn't want them to love their children at his expense. If it becomes a choice between loving your children and loving God, you're supposed to be obedient to God first, and your children take a distant second. And by the way, that's not exclusive to parents and children. It's that way with anybody, any of our human relationships. We're commanded to love other people. We're commanded to be compassionate, to be involved in their lives as much as we can, at least in a positive way, to try to help anybody that asks of us. I mean, you could go on and on and on about the commands that we're given and the advice and instruction that we're given to love other people. But ultimately, anytime that love of somebody else becomes an obstacle to obeying God, then we've got to stop. Because if there's anything in this world, anyone in this world, that we love more than God, that's putting somebody else, a human, on God's throne. That is putting a human being above God. God will not accept that, and shouldn't. There should be nobody that has to compete for God's throne in our hearts. And Eli loved God. Probably a lot. But not as much as he loved his sons. And that's something that God simply would not tolerate. He would not tolerate him because of his not wanting to chastise his sons or not wanting to stop them from doing what they were doing. He would not tolerate Eli putting his son's wants and his son's feelings above his own. Ultimately, he could not put God first in his heart, and that's something that God would not tolerate. And so we see a little bit later, in fact, in the next chapter, sort of a follow-up to this to give us more insight. In 1 Samuel, that's the same verse. Okay, I've got it now. So, sorry, the title there is wrong, but it's supposed to be 1 Samuel 3, 13, and 14, which states, "For I have told him that I am about to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew, because his sons brought a curse on themselves, and he did not rebuke them. Therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by the sacrifice or offering forever." So, first of all, we get a little bit more insight in there because it tells us specifically that Eli refused to rebuke his sons, that he would not stop them from doing their evil practices. And that's why Eli was accountable for their sins. The Bible and the Torah specifically, the law of Moses, is very clear that fathers are not held accountable for the actions of their sons unless they fail in their fatherly duties to rebuke them and to stop them. Now, if your child goes out and does something and you've tried your dead level best to stop them and teach them the right way and they just go on and big fat do it anyway, that's not on you. But that's not what was going on here. Eli had told them to stop, but it was just kind of a, "Oh no, please stop," and that was about it. He told them to knock it off, but ultimately he didn't put his foot down. He didn't kick them out of the priesthood. He did not discipline them the way he would have anybody else in Israel because they were his sons. And Eli was wrong for doing that. Because to him, his sons and their feelings were more important than obeying God. And that's why Eli paid a steep price for what he did. Now, if you read the rest of the story, it continues on that both of his sons were slain, and he actually winds up dying on the very same day. What God promised, what God said, that his house would be cut off and not have an heir, did in fact come to fruition. His household was destroyed because of this. Why would God come down so hard on this family? Why is it that he decided that this was something that was so intolerable that he had to snuff them out? Ultimately, I think it was because he had to set an example. That if you're going to be a representative of me, if you're going to be charged with showing other people what I am and who I am, and you use that as an opportunity to abuse people and take advantage of them for your own personal gain, I'm not tolerating that. God is a very merciful being. He is long-suffering. He has patience with people, but he has no tolerance for that. And I think the reason that he doesn't is he doesn't want people coming, seeking God, seeking him, wanting to know him better, to come across somebody that claims to be a person of God, that is indeed doing the exact opposite of what God wants, would be showing them a picture of God that is the exact opposite of who God really is. That's something pagan religions and heathens of that time did, where priests to their pagan gods would take of the different virgins of the towns or take advantage of people and basically extort them and rob them and take temple taxes and all kinds of other things. That's not who God was, and that is not what he wanted the world to think that he was. That's why he got so upset with them. And I think that that's a sobering reminder to us because remember, we're priests. According to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, all those that are members of the church are priests ourselves, which means we're held to exactly the same standard. We have the exact same responsibility to show who God is to the world. And if we put out a picture of God that is as distorted as Eli's sons, you better believe we'll share in a fate just as bad, if not worse. God was extra hard on them because they held a higher responsibility as people that were supposed to know better and to show God's will and his love and his compassion to other people, and they failed to do so. And if we, as modern Christians, do the same, because we are priests of the kingdom of heaven, ultimately God is going to cut us off from the church just as he cut off Eli from the children of Israel. Stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalreda Church of Christ.